Hi there, and welcome to part two of your early intervention and AAC training. My name is Tana Neufeld, and I am so thrilled to be a part of the DTA team and to be joining you today to share a little bit about how you can engineer the home environment to support language learning through AAC. Our learning objectives for the next roughly hour and a half are really going to be to help give you the strategies that you need to help the families you're coaching engineer their homes to support activities that promote language learning with AAC, and also to promote the availability of those AAC tools within the home so that when those activities start to get fun and motivating, the language that we want to build in those activities is readily available for us. We're also going to work today to describe some of the elements of what a starter AAC system might look like for a young child that you're working with. The training series that you're taking part in right now is certainly not going to go into the vast details of doing a comprehensive AAC assessment, but being in the position as an early intervention provider as you are, you want to make sure that you have at least a basic understanding of some of the elements of an AAC system that could be worth trying with a child even before you get an AAC assessment. So we're going to go through some of those elements of that starter system. And then we're also going to explore 3 types of AAC that could be used during some play and daily routines that you might be working with your families that you support to participate in right now, and how we could use those tools to build participation in language development for the little ones that you're supporting. Going to break this into a couple different sections. We're going to start out by really talking about the elements of that starter AAC system. And then we're going to spend some time thinking about what does engineering the AAC home look like. We'll go through some differences between different types of AAC modalities and some strategies we can use to make those tools available when that language learning moment is happening. We're going to explore some more tools at length. We'll have a lot of ideas today pulled from different sources to inspire you on how you can put AAC tools perhaps in the environment where a play activity is happening, or even in the environment where a diapering activity might be happening. And then we'll leave you some time at the end to reflect and think about what you've learned, and then reach out to your team and ask those questions that are coming to mind to really help you implement this knowledge in your actual practice from day to day. One of the resources that you have included in your presentation today about engineering the home is a Padlet, which is a curation site that I've created for you that has a lot of the links mentioned throughout the slides. So if you're thinking to yourself as you go through this module, hey, I want to know where that resource is and I can't seem to find the link for it in the slide, then you'll go over to the end of your slide deck and head over to that Padlet where we've created some, or curated rather, some resources for you to continue to learn about this topic. So we want you to keep in mind that the cutie that you learned about in part 1, Ethan, we want you to keep that case in your mind as you move through this part of the training and really thinking about some of the things you learned about, especially what you learned about the ways in which he's already communicating. So here's a reminder slide for you, but remember you also have that handout that was provided by Vicki that outlines all of the details about Ethan. And in Vicki's part of the presentation, you also got a chance to see what Ethan's communication profile via the communication matrix looked like. So keep all of that kind of pinned in your mind. And we're going to use Ethan throughout the rest of this module to explore how we might think about features in an AAC tool for a child like Ethan. The first thing I'd like you to do before we move forward is to pause here and think about what you've learned specifically about the ways in which Ethan is already communicating. Remember that Vicki hit on those ideas of means and functions, and that's really what we're thinking about in our early intervention kiddos. What are the ways in which they're already communicating with us, or the means, or the modes, I think is what Vicki described them as. And then what do those mean to that individual? And that's going to be the functions. So you might want to take a minute here to pause the video and just jot down a couple of things that you remember about Ethan that we can use as we carry through and learn about how we're going to match those signals that Ethan already gives us to some symbols through our picture-based modeling with AAC tools. So obviously, we all know how important it is to obtain a comprehensive AAC assessment with any family that you're working with, including those who are supporting little ones under the age of 5. But we know that that's also really difficult to do sometimes in the time frame that you would like to have it happen. So I want to leave you here with this caveat of obtain a comprehensive AAC assessment whenever possible, as soon as possible. But until then, you still can start thinking about how to build AAC perspectives, tools, and strategies into what you're already doing to support your families. So we're going to talk about that piece. So here we're reminded that really the purpose of our AAC system is to provide access to some of the goals that we want our little ones to meet in their AAC and their communication journey overall. So when we're thinking about that idea of bridging from abilities to goals, we really want to focus on what is it about our AAC starter system that's going to help that learner get to those goals in the shorter term before we actually obtain that AAC assessment. So, there's pros and cons to each of these approaches. If you think about a comprehensive AAC assessment is really going to give you that very detailed picture of the features of the AAC system that are going to work best for that student long term. However, as we talked about in the previous slide, it's not always possible to get that comprehensive assessment. And so the accessibility of that assessment, both in terms of providers available to do it, the waiting list that may be, present at that facility that offers that service, all of those can be barriers to actually getting started with an AAC system. We also know that sometimes families don't have the resources to fund an assessment within an organization that may be able to provide an at-length assessment. And so we want to make sure that we're thinking about the importance of these detailed oriented assessments, but also that we may have some barriers that we need to facilitate and support access to in the meantime, while the student is waiting for that more uniform assessment. So when we think about here the second option, which is starting with that AAC system as a starter system, we really think about conducting that basic assessment that's going to help us either select or create a starter system that's going to match that student's current abilities to their goals. So one of the benefits of this approach is you can get started with it tomorrow. You can put that starter AAC system into place. You can provide some support, provide some intervention strategies and coaching to the family, and really learn a ton about what aspects of that starter system are really working well for a learner and what you want to modify and adjust over time. So it can really help you not only support that learner right now with what they need to be able to do, but also help support your ability as a provider to get more information for the future, so that when you either try to tackle a comprehensive AAC assessment on your own, because that's maybe a professional goal you have, or you reach out to someone who can mentor you or support the family in that way, you have all of a sudden all of this information that you've gained over the time you've using this starter system to help inform that decision-making process. That learner also begins to learn how to invest and buy into an AAC system, and the family does as well. So when we can create these starter system opportunities, we really help the buy-in process start early in the development of the child, and we allow that family to navigate some of their perhaps apprehensions. As Vicki discussed in her portion of the modules, there's a lot of myths still surrounding using AAC systems for children this young. And so sometimes getting a starter system in place, especially perhaps one that's a light tech or a low tech system, which we'll learn about in a couple slides, can take a little bit of that mystification away and give the family and the learner some time to get their feet wet, dip their toe in the water, and figure out what this whole AAC thing is about. We know that one of the disadvantages of this AAC starter system approach is that the system that you come up with as a team is maybe not going to be the one that's the best fit. It may not be a perfect fit. It may not be a perfect fit for the short term or a perfect fit for the long term. And so we know it's not the place that we're going to end. However, we can use that information again to inform our decision-making process. So if we figure out what we don't like about a system that we're starting with, and we figure out the elements that are missing to make that system effective, that can inform our next phase in the assessment process. We also know that one of the disadvantages of taking this starter system approach is that there's a very good likelihood that that child's AAC system will change over time. And we know in the research and practical evidence that we have that we want to do our best from the very beginning to have a child be provided with access to a system that is pretty predictable, to get that motor plan down. And so we know that this is not ideal, that we would start with a system and not end with that system. And so it is a risk in taking a starter approach. But hopefully, as you're weighing your options, you can consider what's going to work best for you and your team as providers, and also for the student and for the family supporting them. Is it best to move forward with this starter approach, or to simply wait and get in and have that assessment? That'll be a decision that'll happen on a case-by-case basis. So I've taken a moment here to put in some notes that I recall from reviewing Ethan's case. I'd love for you to take a moment here again to pause the video and think about some of the elements that you recall from Ethan's case in these three areas. The first one here is we're thinking about what are Ethan's abilities, and you just made a list in the prior slide where I asked you to talk about the means and the functions that Ethan was expressing already. So that's where we're going to put abilities. You can also see a couple more abilities that I've outlined here on your slide that really have more to do with Ethan's interest and his preference, which is certainly a strength that he brings to any learning opportunity. So we'll want to make sure that we're thinking about those as well. The second piece we want to think about is needs. And mostly here, what I want to think about for a child like Ethan is what are his physical needs that are going to really either support or hinder the access process when it comes to AAC. And so you can see here, we've mentioned mobility. Both fine motor and gross motor are impairments for Ethan. And so mobility is going to be one of his needs. He also has some extensive vision needs. He has strabismus and CVI, which were documented in his case profile. And so we know that those are going to be needs that have to be supported in the learning process. Ethan and his family are also English language learners. So that is a need, both a cultural need and a logistical need, right? We need to be able to have the ability to communicate effectively with Ethan and his family. And we also need to have tools that support his cultural needs in terms of being able to provide language in his native language of Spanish. The last row here that I'd love for you to think about is what are Ethan's goals? And so when we're thinking about goals, as Vicki mentioned, we're first considering what the student is currently doing. And that's where you've come up with your list of means and functions, and you have a little bit of an idea of where Ethan is compared to where Ethan would like to be to participate in his everyday life. And so you likely already have some IFSP goals that you've drafted for a student like Ethan in your mind today. And in those goals, you've got some next step skills based on development and based on activities of daily living that you know will be essential to work on with Ethan and his family. We're going to keep those at the front of our mind because at the end of the day, the goals are still the goals, even if AAC is involved. And although we may put in some AAC related language in our written goals, and we certainly may provide AAC related tools and strategies to facilitate our goals, the goals are the goals, and they're going to stay the goals regardless of the means in which we choose to achieve them as a team. Let's take a minute then to talk a little bit about the starter system elements. You know, what is it that makes for an appropriate and hopefully effective AAC starter system if you go with this approach? The first thing we want to think about in any starter system is it has to be an accessible system. And so remember, we just talked a little bit about Ethan's needs, both in the vision and the motor areas. If you have learners who have sensory processing needs, if you have learners who have even more, perhaps involved motor needs in which they can't hold their head up, they have a hard time sitting up unsupported. All of these needs are going to come into play when you're thinking about the accessibility of a starter system. You're going to really rely on your motor colleagues and your vision colleagues and others to help you here, to really help you gain a holistic picture of this learner's needs so that you can see how these AAC tools that are matching their language needs pair up with your accessibility needs. And that's always kind of the compromise that we're thinking of in AAC work is I want to give this student access to all of the language, all the words, the robust tools. But I know that I also have to consider their accessibility of those tools. And sometimes that means I may have to make some limitations or some adjustments to simplify the physical complexity of accessing that language. And hopefully you'll get a chance to talk a little bit more in that in your modules upcoming about partner strategies when it comes to helping students with accessibility challenges access their language. The second thing we need to think about in our starter systems is they really have to be useful. And we're going to talk in a couple slides about one element of this, which is they need to have the words available that the learner wants to say, right? The words available that really help that learner have agency and joy in the activity that they want to participate in. They need to have messages perhaps in those words that are meaningful to that learner. So we talk a lot in AAC about customizing our systems so that they have the vernacular of the particular learner. So how does the learner's older brother, for example, talk about things that he likes? Does he just say, I like that? Or does he say, oh man, that's awesome, or any other number of age-appropriate phrases that may come from an older sibling. And so we want to make sure that messaging is useful to that learner and to the group in which they spend most of their time. We also need to make sure that the symbols are a useful way of that learner being able to recruit accessing that language. And so this is where we might consider where we want to use photos over drawn images. Or we want to make sure that we're using images that have a certain saturation or salience to them, for example, if we're working with a learner like Ethan who has vision impairment. Another thing we talk a lot about when it comes to the usefulness of an AAC system is thinking about two types of broad vocabulary needs. The first type is called coverage vocabulary. And so we want to make sure that this starter system has all the words that will cover the things that Ethan wants to talk about right now, the things that he's most interested in, that he's already expressing the signals to communicate for. But then there's a second type of vocabulary called called developmental vocabulary. And so that vocabulary is going to be, what are we thinking about for the couple steps in the future for Ethan? What do we need to provide access to so that his parents can model language and build him developmentally beyond where he is right now in his communication signals? So that usefulness really is those words are available. They're words that that child wants to say. The messaging of those words is suitable, it's fitting to that child's group, their family group, their peer group. It's represented using symbols that that child can discern and learn. They can visually see them and they're meaningful to that child. And also they have enough words for both coverage and development. The third element we want to talk about in a starter system is that it is feasible. And here's where we're really going to think about what are the preferences of the child and the family. Is this a system that's likely to be implemented by these key partners, these caregivers, and also others on the team that are charged with supporting this family and learner? I would also consider here feasibility is, can you get your hands on this system as the provider leading this effort? We may think that a system is a fantastic option to try, but if we can't get our hands on a loaner in order to see if it works, then it isn't feasible for our current situation. And so we've got some difficult choices to make there. The last element we want to consider is this system acceptable? And this is, again, where we're going to consider the child and family preferences. Is this culturally inclusive for this family? Does it have representation for this learner and family? Does it have their language? Is it in a voice that's appropriate for the child's gender, for the child's physical stature, and also for the child's cultural dialect? Here on the slide, you can also see just a very broad visual representation of all the different ways that we think about an AAC system being built. And what I want you to really take away from this slide, in addition to those 4 elements of the starter system that are very worthwhile to consider, is that AAC systems are multimodal. When we talk about the term AAC system, we don't think about just the high-tech system, just the voice output system, which is pictured here on your upper right with that blue high-tech device. The system is all the ways in which spoken communication is being augmented or replaced, or is, as the name suggests, right, augmented or alternative. And so here we're thinking about no tech. That's all the facial expressions and gestures, the vocalization and inflection that many of our little ones use already to communicate, and also sign language. So anything in the body that we don't require an outside tool in order to utilize would be considered no tech. And I think it's very important to remember that that's not just symbolic no tech, such as ASL or sign language, and it's also pre-symbolic low tech or no tech, which is all of those gestures and other modes that I just mentioned. To the left, we've got light or low tech, and you'll see this referred to as light or low tech depending on where you read about it. And so I've included both of those labels here for that purpose. But in essence, it's communication boards and books. So those two-dimensional or sometimes three-dimensional communication boards and books that will outline a variety of vocabulary. Sometimes it's related to more core words. Other times you may see it related to more fringe or activity-based vocabulary. But light tech means there's no batteries, there's no voice output. It's likely printed or some sort of 3D representation of the concept. So for example, as in the use of tangible symbols, where you might see somebody using a partial piece of a fork, for example, to represent an eating routine rather than a picture of the fork. That would still be considered light tech. Right above light tech, we have mid tech. So mid tech is going to be anything that has batteries and creates a voice, but it doesn't have the dynamic nature of being able to change pages. So you can see two options are listed here, just as general visual representations of this idea of mid tech. One of them is a grid-based or picture-based display that would just have one message on each button, and there would be no page turning. There would be no way to move from one page to the other unless you took out that printed page, you put in a new page, and you had a whole other set of recorded messages. The little red button next to it is a Big Mac, and there's lots of different ways to use this concept of the Big Mac in more consumer-ready tools that are available. There's voice recorded buttons actually now available on Amazon for just everybody to buy. It used to be that you had to go through a particular assistive technology company in order to get them, but they're actually available consumer ready now and also through our assistive technology companies. But that would be a message that's on that button where that learner could push it and the message would speak. Some of the buttons have the ability to record sequential messages. And so the learner can push the button several times and get different messages each time they push it as they cycle through that whole sequence of messages. So mid-tech is something that produces voice output. It has batteries, but it doesn't have that page turning like high-tech, which is pictured here to the right. So everything after that, of course, would be those dynamic display or devices that change pages and then in therein offer tons of vocabulary because they have lots of pages. Most of us are used to seeing these on tablets now. And so any of your apps that are communication and AAC related would be considered a high-tech AAC system or AAC device. So let's talk a little bit now about what do we mean by engineer? And in a sense, engineering is really just our way of talking about being proactive, right? We want to really maximize the likelihood that we're setting up this environment and this activity in a way that helps us teach the language that we're after. And so engineering usually causes for a little bit of pre-planning, right? It's something that is required. We've got to be able to plan ahead in order to know what we want to elicit and what we want to model, for example, as far as the words go. So we're going to think about designing our tools and our environment ahead of time for that purpose of making sure we know what we want to model and what we want to teach and also what we want to try to get that child to practice. We're going to be planning for what I like to think about, and I've borrowed this from my friend and mentor, Dr. Carol Zangari. She likes to talk a lot about this concept of taught versus taught. And our kids are catching what we're teaching all of the time. As you speak to these little ones, they are catching language and meaning, even when you're not trying to teach them, right? Anybody who's ever made the mistake of saying a curse word in front of a child under the age of 3 that is speaking knows exactly what that is. They catch it, they recognize it, they learn it, even if you didn't mean to teach it to them. There's also these taught moments that we have with our little ones, and that's where we're really being intentional about the characteristics of the activity and the things that that learner is finding most enjoyable and motivating in that activity. And we're using those to maximize the learning potential by being very specific in what we want to model or teach there. So I've created a little mnemonic here to help us think about how do we engineer? How do we pre-plan and think about these caught and taught moments? As you see here in the center of the slide, the letters APT are the word apt. And you know the word apt as a definition is really having a tendency to actually do something. You're more apt to XYZ, right? And so I thought it was really fitting here because the bottom line about today is we really want to make sure that we're maximizing our ability to have language available to model in a visual form for our learners who are complex communicators. So we're more apt to do this when we have a couple things in place. And so we're going to talk about those few things now. The A in ACT is all about activities. And in the activities, which we'll share in a moment, we're really talking about the what and the why of why we're doing something, right? It's that fun thing that we're doing, that really motivating activity or routine rather that we do every day as a family. That's what we're going to think about engineering in that A for activity. In the places and spaces, we're going to talk about more where does that activity happen and what do we need to think about in terms of supporting that learner within that activity, both with regard to their language, but also the other needs that we've identified, right? So if we have a child like Ethan who has mobility needs, and for example, isn't sitting independently on the floor, which is where the family eats their meals, what do we have to think about in terms of Ethan's positioning and also the positioning of his AAC tools to make the teaching of AAC within that meal environment actually stick and actually be accessible for him? And then the T is for tools. And of course, we need to have tools everywhere we are with our learners in order to make sure that we're modeling on them. And so we'll talk about some ways to think outside of the box to make those tools available. Here, let's start with our activities. That's our A in the ACT acronym. And for our activities, really, as I said before, we're thinking about the when and the how. When and how do I want to teach language with AAC? Do I want to do it during bath time? Do I want to do it during mealtime? Is diapering a good time? Transitions to and from the car? So we're going to really help our families think about these activities, these when and how moments, so that we can nail down what words we need, which we're going to talk about in a minute. With the when and how, I also want to encourage you to think about the elements of a routine and whether or not an activity is different in your mind and whether or not perhaps there's a good reason to think about activities and routines as different opportunities for building language. And pin that in your mind for a moment. We'll revisit it in a little bit when we talk through this slide. But thinking about how you currently support families, do you consider a difference between activities and routines? So the when and the how, that's what we're doing when we're teaching this language. And then we also need to think, as I said before, what are the words and the functions that I want to teach during this activity? That's also part of the A. If we're doing a diapering activity, there's going to be certain words and certain communication functions related to that, which may be very different, for example, if we're playing a bubbles game together. So as EI providers, you all are aware of the recipe for a great routine. And some of the things you may think about when you think about what makes a routine fantastic for teaching language are that it's predictable, right? is something that happens a lot, and it happens in a pretty similar way. There's likely a start and a middle and an end to this routine, and that little student has a role to play in the routine. It's not something that happens to them, it's something that happens with them. Right. So I want you to recruit here and maybe even make a list for yourself of all the things that make for the greatest recipe for the greatest routine, because you're going to use those in this AAC learning process as well. With that, as you think about what makes up a routine, I want you to also consider that question from a moment prior, which is, what are routines versus activities? Is there a difference in the way that I currently support learners and families? And if there is, what is that difference? And here you can see I'm encouraging you to also think about it in terms of caught and taught. And so I'll give you an example of how I believe that routines and activities can be a little bit different. When I think about routines, I think about not just play, but more daily care routines, right? So if I think about my own family, we have a ritual. We wake up in the morning. I'm usually up ahead of everybody. We have breakfast. There's dressing. There's a little bit of playtime. There's getting our stuff ready to go out the door. So all of these routines that happen every day, they're usually related to care and also getting people from one place to the other. And so those are great, and those may be very good places for you to work with families on building language. But outside of those routines, the things that happen all of the time, where there may be quite a bit of learning that's caught just from the predictability of that routine, and then even more so from your intentional focus and proactivity on certain words that you want to model and have be taught during that routine. There are also maybe some things that you want to use specifically to help teach a concept. And that's where I think activities are coming into play. So, for example, if there is a routine that a learner really enjoys that helps me model a little bit about the word go, for example, maybe it's we're going to go to the car so that we can go to the park. My modeling opportunity is really kind of limited there, isn't it? Because there's maybe 2 to 4 times in that routine where we're talking about the concept of going. So the learner may catch that and just me modeling it within that transition to and from the park. But what about if I really wanted to nail in the concept of go? And maybe I even wanted to encourage that learning through use of the concept of stop, because it's a very good contrast. Could I create an activity either at the park or maybe even somewhere else in the child's day that would be specifically beneficial to teaching the concepts of go and stop? The answer is probably yes for you. And I'm sure that your mind is going, a million miles an hour. And oh, yeah, well, we could do, go and stop on the swing, and we could do go and stop on the slide. And we could do even create an activity where we maybe push around in the car, in the toy car out in the backyard, and do go and stop specifically with that activity. Whatever we're doing, whether it's a routine or it's an activity, when we're thinking about the A of ACT, we really want to start with what the child loves. And so we're going to revisit here a little bit about what Ethan loves. Remember from his case history, he's got several social routines that pop up in his profile. Many of them have to do with being close with people he cares about. We've got some shadow puppets, we've got time at the park and a swing, lullabies with his dad. And so all of these may be activities and routines that we want to think about as Ethan's team as great places to start building language for him. Now, obviously, each one of these routines is going to have different ways in which Ethan is currently signaling, so different means or modes, and different functions for those means and modes, what those signals mean for him. And therefore, they're all going to have different words. And some of the words may cross over, but largely there's going to be some different words of focus within each one of these routines. So as we move through Ethan's profile for the rest of this module, I'm going to scoop up one of his loves, which is swinging in the adaptive swing, and use that to kind of walk us through the next stage that we think about with activities, which is what are the words that we want to really help Ethan learn in this activity. One of the strategies I really love to use when I'm thinking about the words that go along with an activity is making a word map. And so I've included here a template for you to consider what a word map might look like. There's a blank template at the link in your curated resources that you can walk through with your own activity and your own student in mind. But here we walked through one for Ethan, and we're thinking about his swinging, which is here on the bottom, AAC word map for the routine of swinging. And then within the heart, we thought about the things that Ethan loves the most about swinging, right? And this is where you're really challenging yourself to think a little broader beyond, well, he likes to swing. What does he like about the swing? Does he like it most when dad or mom swings him? Does he like it most when he swings high and fast? Or does he like it most when he swings slow and gentle? So really helping families think about that routine a little bit bigger. What is it that Ethan really loves in that routine? And if we're not sure, let's play around with the routine and see if he can show us preference using the signals he already has. So from those preferences, what we hope to get is more and more of an idea of a word cloud, kind of surrounding this routine. And so you can see here at the top left of the graphic, the far left-hand side says core words. And we came up with a few core words that are related to the swinging activity, keeping Ethan's loves in mind. And so on the slide here, we've got things like go, stop, more, big, little, up, different, and no. So these are some of the core words that might pop up as great shot or taught moments for Ethan in the swinging. And then of course we need fringe words as well. And so they may be other places in the park that Ethan likes to go. Maybe he wants to ask for the slide, or maybe he wants to ask for going and sitting under the tree. Or if he does have a preference of who swings him, maybe he wants to ask for mom or dad or his sister to swing him. And so the fringe words are going to be all those words surrounding that activity that are not considered core or hard frequency words. They're a little more specific just to that activity. And then here to the far right, we've also taken some of those words that were brainstormed around core and fringe, and we put them together into phrases. Excuse me. So we may want to have some phrase-based modeling for Ethan, or more importantly, for a child who is a little bit above Ethan's level, a child who is a first word learner already, but is working on building the vocabulary and learning how to put words together. Phrases are even a more important target for families to have in mind as they're modeling and talking during these activities. So this is a very quick way to think about words. You know, the strategies I like to use when I'm thinking about making a word map are really to observe the child and their caregivers doing this routine. So we might plan a visit at the park together, and I may observe Ethan with his mom and his dad and his siblings at the park. And all the while I'm making notes of the language that seems to be coming up. What is mom saying? What is dad saying? What is his big brother saying? Let's write them all down. And then I may look at Ethan. How is he signaling during this routine? Is he using his gestures and his vocalizations? And what do they mean? That's the means and functions list that we made earlier on in the presentation. Those are all going to have potential word matches to them. So I'm going to write down those signals. I'm going to say, ha. So when Ethan kicks his feet, when his brother approaches the swing, I really think he's saying no, don't, or not. So that might be a great word to put on my word map. So I'm observing, I'm looking at Ethan's signals, I'm making note of some words that match those signals. I'm listening to mom and dad and others involved in the routine. What are they already saying around this routine? Let's make sure we put that on our list. And then from that hopefully big list, we're narrowing in on, okay, what is going to most match Ethan's preferences in this routine? Let's put those core words and those fringe words on our word map so that we know what needs to be available on our tool, and we know how to coach the families to prioritize on that activity of what they want to model for him. Next, we hit places and spaces. So once we figured out where and how we want to teach the language and what words we're going to use, we need to figure out, okay, well, where does this routine actually happen? Excuse me, I misspoke. It's when and how, not where and how. So where does this routine actually happen? Where does this activity actually happen? And what are some of the physical needs that need to be in consideration based on where that happens? I want to think about how I can adjust the environment so that it's actually suitable and accessible for the learner. And then I'm going to certainly collaborate with my team here, right? Because chances are, if you're thinking at depth about places and spaces, you're really thinking about a child like Ethan, who has some physical needs, some vision needs, and we want to make sure that we are working with our team members who have expertise in that area to think about how we want to adjust positioning and adjust supports to accommodate for those needs. Some of our students may not have physical needs, however, and we might need to think about, in the home especially, is this activity in a very distracting place? Is one of the ways that we're going to engineer the environment by turning the TV off. So maybe we want to put in our coaching when we're doing this activity, we want to make sure that we turn Miss Rachel off of YouTube so that we can really engage together in this activity and avoid as much distraction as possible. Or maybe we want to think about safety. And here, I really want to emphasize that safety is not necessarily physical safety, as many of our children are going to be safe in their homes. And it may not be of an utmost concern to you as a provider, the physical safety of a child during a learning experience like this. But we also want to think about emotional safety. We want to think about sensory safety. So some of the ways in which our learners, perhaps with sensory processing challenges, or maybe diagnoses or higher likelihoods of having autism, may have some difficulties feeling safe socially or sensory or social emotionally within certain environments. So for example, if the dog barking sends our learner into a startle reflex or sends them running for the closet, then we might have to engineer the environment for the dog to be put in a quiet space away from the activity so that it doesn't cause this sense of fight or flight in the learner. And I'm sure you can think of some other ways. So for example, I've had learners who are really sensitive to loud singing and high energy voices. And so if a family member who's engaging in this teaching moment with the learner is using too much affect, that child may not feel safe. They may feel as though a sensory assault is happening to them, which is really going to interfere with the way that they engage in that activity. And so we may have to coach adapting that place and space, which includes that partner, to adjust their interaction style so that that child feels safer from a sensory perspective and is therefore more willing to engage for the time it will take to learn language in that activity. The last piece here we want to think about is position and participation. And so coming back to thinking about a child like Ethan, who has fine and gross motor differences, are there things we need to consider, adapt, adjust in order for that child, for Ethan, to be able to attend visually and physically participate in that activity in a way that keeps it meaningful, motivating, and effective for that child? And here we might want to think about, there might be some different ways in which Ethan communicates, some ways we teach him new signals, for example, that lend themselves better to particular positions than others. And so this is once again more reason to think about multiple ways of representing language and communication so that we have these different situations that we can support more effectively, such as different positioning. All right, the last piece of our ACT acronym is T for tools. We've talked about when and how we want to teach language through our activities and also what words we want to use. We've also talked about places and spaces, the P, right? Where are these activities going to happen and how am I going to adapt that environment with the family so that that learner is engaged and able to take the most from it? Here we're going to talk about what the AAC tools are. So what tools do I need in order to be able to help this child say the words that they want to say during that routine or activity within the place and the space where it is most likely to occur? Here we want to make tools available, and I have a couple strategies to try to encourage this. Remember, when the tools are available and we thought ahead of time, we are more apt to model, and modeling is really 90% of our task here in the early intervention years, really laying that visual language down just the way that we lay the verbal language down for our learners who do not have complex communication needs. One of the ways I love to make AAC tools available is to simply carry them. And so at the top of the slide here, you can see two examples of carrying AAC hands-free. Shoulder straps are your friend when you're moving and following a toddler around, especially families with active toddlers that are moving quicker than others. And so anything that you can use to create a shoulder strap, either on a high-tech or a light-tech device, as is pictured here, is really going to help make that tool available where the partner is. All of our AAC users that are under the age of 5 and some even beyond that age, if they're an emerging communicator, they're really going to rely on you as the partner to take ownership of having that availability of the AAC tool. Although we love for our 3-year-olds to be carrying around their communication book or their high-tech device, it's just really not realistic for the learning stage and the maturity level of most of them. And so if we can put that on the partner, so if mom can wear it, or if the daycare provider can wear it, then we know that when that child comes to communicate with somebody, because they're going to communicate with a person, the language for modeling is going to be right there and available. Hands-free is also important because we want to be doing something while we're modeling this language. So if I have to hold this device and move it around, or hold this communication book and move it around, I don't have the hands to keep someone safe. I don't have the hands to manipulate the activity or support the child's body or whatever, you name it. I don't have the hands to do that. So trying to make hands-free using a shoulder strap is really the best first strategy to think about. If you have students that are using, well, let me go backwards first. Let's talk about duplicate first. So say we're thinking about a child like Ethan who doesn't have an established AAC tool yet. There's no device or communication book available to him. So I want to make sure that I have duplicate forms of language available. And so that might be, I have duplicates of the same communication board and I make them available all throughout the home so that it's at the, at arm's reach for mom and dad. But it also might mean that I have different ways of demonstrating or displaying the same language, depending on where the activity is happening. So for example, at the dinner table, or for Ethan, it's on the dinner carpet, he eats on the floor. I might have a core language board available or some other way of representing core vocabulary available there in that space. But I also might have some choice boards representing some of the foods that Ethan wants up in the food pantry. So if his mother is carrying him and they move into the kitchen to go prepare a snack, that she can model for him right where that food is being gathered, the symbols for the food labels. So thinking a little bit outside of one communication board only, we can have multiples of that same communication board, or we can have language represented across several different types of technology embedded in different aspects of the home. And we're going to talk about embedding in just a moment here. The third bullet we're thinking about here is the idea of using backups. So if you do have a child who is using a high-tech system, for example, you want to make sure that you have backups that are light tech. And so some of our app companies, which I've included in your resources, your curated resources on the Padlet, have been generous and offered printed versions of many of their high-tech displays. So here on the slide, you can see at the very bottom, this is a touch chat core book, which is created by PRC Centillo. You can print this as is off their website. You can customize it with some language for your learners, and therefore you would have a backup for a user who uses TouchChat in a high-tech platform. You may also just want to have backups, as I said, through that idea of duplication. So maybe this child has TouchChat with word power on their high-tech device, and then you have a core book pictured here like this one that mom and dad have each in their car. And then maybe you have a miniature version of this that mom keeps in her purse. And so there's lots of duplicates so that when the words need to be available, they're available. In the center here, you can see two devices, a smaller and a larger, that are both running a high-tech AAC system. And this is another way of thinking about this idea of backup or duplication. Most of our high-tech apps, if your student is using one of them and your family has purchased it, they're going to have access to up to about 5 versions of that on all of their different technology running on the same platform. So it's not uncommon to have a family that may have a tablet with an app running on it for the student, And then mom has the same thing running on her phone. And that way she can model on her phone, either when the student has their tablet or when they're out and about and mom forgot the tablet or the battery's dead or the student's using the tablet for something else, like playing an app. Mom has the same language available right there on her phone and can take advantage of that modeling moment then. So the point of this slide here is we really want to make sure we're modeling on consistent tools as much as possible, but sometimes having something available is going to be much better than having nothing available. And so when we can't carry that one system around and have it work for us, we might think about making duplicates, either high tech or light tech, using backups to high tech, right? Using that laminated sheet of paper in the pool is much better than trying to put the tablet in the pool when you're at aquatherapy. And so thinking about backups is just a good rule of thumb in general for kids to use high-tech devices. And then also we're going to think about embedding all of these different versions of tools into the environment so that they're at arm's reach. And that's what we're going to think about now in our next slide. So here you have a little glimpse of a home. And I'm sure that it's got many of the common elements that you're used to seeing in the homes that you visit. You know, we've got a living space, we've got some play opportunities going around. So as you're walking into the homes of the families that you support, I'd love for you to use this image as inspiration of thinking about the space in a little bit of a different way. Where could you embed AAC here in this space to support the activities, right? The when, and the what, right? What am I going to say during this activity? And then the where in the places and spaces. Where does this activity happen, right? So what does this family normally do here in this living space? And how could we make tools available embedded in the space so that modeling and teaching can happen with less barriers? So I'm just going to point out a couple examples of how things have been embedded here in this space. Now, I want to emphasize this is not a space that includes tools that would be highly appropriate for a child like Ethan. Given Ethan's physical and vision needs, his tools are going to look a little bit different, but I wanted to provide you with more of a generic, for lack of a better term, way of thinking about how to engineer spaces for children, maybe a little more straightforward on your caseload. So here in our visual, if you go all the way to the far left, you can see we've got a door hanger that has some language related to coming and going. And so if you've got a little one who likes to go to the door and has to go outside in the backyard, you might create a light text support, put it right there on the door and have some language related to coming and going, demonstrated by that child's signals already. Here in the planter, we've got a little visual that talks about some of the activities that we may do in watering the plants together. And so if you've got a child who likes to do chores or keep up the home in some way, how can we put some technologies or some light tech supports there that have language related to their participation in that job? Here at the bottom, there's a box of books. I love encouraging families to have books available all throughout the home so that kids can stumble upon them. And then right in front of the book box, we also have a communication book full of activity-based boards that are related specifically to the different books in that box. And I'm going to show you some up-close examples of what that might look like in just a minute. Here on the snack table, as you can see, we've got a delicious bowl of goldfish, we have a juice box here, and then we also have a chat mat, which is just a little printed light tech board that's got some language related to snack time right there on the coffee table, so that as we're eating that snack, this little one is exposed to some opportunities for us to model those language forms that are related to snack. You also see here we've got a pillow that's got some core language printed on it. And so this may be a great place to cuddle, snuggle, do rough and tumble play. If that pillow is involved in building a fort, or giving squeezes or input or any type of other activity that the child likes to do in this couch area, we have that language right available there on the pillow for mom and dad to model. Coming over to the right-hand side, you can see we've got some bins here. Maybe they have some toys in them. And so how can we then create access to language related to the toys within that bin right there where that activity is selected? So that if the child goes over and they pull out that bottom bin that's got blocks in it, then mom and dad have that board readily available to take off the basket and start modeling language about blocks. The last one I want to mention here is on this side table, I've put a little Amazon Echo. One of the most fun activities I've seen in the last couple of years as the Amazon Echo has become more accessible to people financially is moms and dads using the Echo for really amazing ways to give their kids with physical needs agency. And so here I've put a little Go Talk app in front of the Amazon Echo, and we'll see some close-up versions of the Go Talk in just a moment. And we've programmed it with some phrases to tell Alexa what songs this learner loves for her to play. And so you can use that voice output of the mid-tech, such as a Go Talk Now, to give Alexa commands and have her play favorite songs or say favorite jokes or whatever else that learner is interested in. So the takeaway here from this slide is when we're thinking about that APT acronym and thinking about engineering, embedding supports can be a really powerful way to make the tools available. If they're not at arm's reach, no one's going to model on them. I'm just telling you, that's the realistic perspective. We want to have that one perfect system be carried around the home and taken everywhere. But the point of the matter is at this stage in the learning process for these little ones, it's usually not the case. And families are juggling a lot, as you know. And so if we can take some of those best practices and bring them into an embedded AAC environment like this, what we hope to see is more modeling, more thinking about how language could be built into this routine. It just is a great visual reminder and a catalyst to get families changing habits and becoming more supportive of language learning opportunities within their daily life. So we've gone through a lot, but let's wrap up here and really explore some tools. Tools are the fun part. Everybody tends to like this, thinking about how can I create or adapt or even just acquire tools that are ready-made to help my learners say the things they want to say, doing the things that they love to do. And so first, we're going to tackle some light and low-tech options. Most of the examples I'm going to share with you come from Mary Catherine Daly, who is an Instagrammer. Her handle is AAC for all. She is so fantastically creative. She comes up with amazing do-it-yourself strategies for putting core language and adapting toys and adapting activities. She's just a wonderful person to follow if you are on Instagram. And so at the bottom of your slide, I've linked her Instagram account. I also put her in the curated resources at the end of the slide so that you can have her webpage available to you for even more ideas than I share today. Anywhere you see a link in the slide from this point forward, you can link to that resource, and I've also included it in your curated Padlet as well. So remember, light and low tech supports are no batteries, no dynamic display. These are printed or tangible items that we can use to represent language for our learners. So at the very left-hand side here, I've considered what is called context-based light tech support. So context-based supports are another way of talking about activity-specific language. So when you're thinking about the language that occurs maybe only during snack time, it might be things like this right-hand side picture, which is snack choices. So maybe a context-based way to represent snack time language would be to put some snack choices on a board like you see here, pop it into a pencil case that's got an open window in the front, and then hang it on the pantry. And all of a sudden, you've embedded language related to the context of getting a snack right there where the snack happens, right there in the middle of the action. On the left-hand side, we also see another way to represent this context, and this is offering a mix of fringe and core vocabulary. This is a snack tray, and along the side, you've got some core words that represent words related to eating snack, and they're right there embedded in the context where snack happens so that that child can use those words and the adult partner can model them while the snack is happening. So context-based is going to be those words that are right there related to the context. Some of them might be core and some of them may be fringe, but either way, they're going to relate very specifically to that activity. And so then putting them with the activity where it happens in the home or in the community or in the car or in the stroller, etc., is going to be a really powerful way to make those words available. On the right-hand side here, we've got core-based like tech and low tech supports. And so core-based are going to be words that happen across activities. So with these supports, you're not going to see fringe vocabulary or the names of things. You're not going to see nouns on these types of supports. What you're going to see is a lot of action words, describing words that really represent things that you can talk about across many different activities and across many different conversational topics. So this is a very popular trend in the last couple of years, people creating playground boards and putting them up in playgrounds and play space areas. This is something that you could put in Ethan's backyard, right? And something that his siblings could use to model language for him while he's participating in the play space outside. On the right-hand side, we've got core language represented on those rubber tiles that you can put on the floor. And that's a great space for crawlers. So if you've got kids who are log rolling, crawling around on the floor, and you want to provide access to some core-based language that they can use for many different games that occur on the floor, this is one way to represent that in a core-based light text support. Next, let's talk a little bit about mid-tech. And remember, mid-tech are those tools that have batteries and voice output. However, they do not have dynamic display. So they do not move pages, right? They don't go from one page to the next to the next. And so the vocabulary is a little bit more limited. But with our mid-tech, we can think about two main reasons for using mid-tech. On the far left side of your slide here, we have participation. And so here what we're thinking about is how could we embed mid-tech or use mid-tech in an activity or a routine in a way that really encourages that child to have an active role to play. And so they might not actually have access to a lot of language to build developmental language, but they have a way to participate that is accessible for them and feasible for them and meaningful for them. So two examples here on your screen are the left-hand side is a talking photo album. So say, for example, Ethan has a birthday party coming up or a birthday party in the past, and he wants to be able to tell his grandparents about it. We might have a talking photograph or talking album that has many different photographs of the different things that Ethan did at that birthday party, people who came, the presents that were available, and then we can program some messages in the talking photo album. Sorry about that, a little bit of a technical glitch, but we're back. So we were just talking about that talking photo album and some ways that you might be able to use a strategy like that for a child who wants to participate in the activity of talking about a special event or special people in their lives. Right next to it, I've included a couple voice output switches that just have one message each. And this is, again, a strategy from Mary Catherine Daly, who has used these for some weekend and what I did at school types of communication. So say you have a learner who goes to daycare and they want to have a way to share some important friends that they might have seen at daycare. Or vice versa, they want to be able to tell their teacher what exciting things they did with their family over the weekend. Mary Catherine has two buttons here. One of them is programmed with a what I did over the weekend message. That's the one on the left-hand side. And then the other one is what fun things happened to me at school today. So you might be able to program some of these, or mom and dad can, and pop them into the backpack and use them as a way for the child to participate in that personal narrative. When it's age appropriate, of course, children usually start doing this maybe later on in their second year of life, or if you're working with some preschoolers between the age of 3 and 5, this would definitely be a communication function that is something that they would be able to participate in. On the right-hand side here, in contrast to that idea of using mid-tech for participation, we have this idea of language building. And so we can use mid-tech and light tech to build language when we have access to a robust vocabulary. That's the best way to build language, but sometimes we need to simplify things a little bit more, or perhaps what we have available to us is mid-tech. And so we want to use some of those tools to help with language building. So here on the right-hand side, Mary Catherine has also adapted an old GoTalk device, which you may have available to you in some of your centers or loan libraries. She's got some core vocabulary on that base device, which has voice output. And then she's got some fringe vocabulary along the top that's more related to particular activities or categories that can then be modeled or used by that learner to expand on their core word message. Now let's move to high tech. And here we've got 3 different ways of thinking about high tech that all have their own role to play for some or many of your learners in this early intervention stage. On the left-hand side, I'm encouraging you to think here about that basic coverage vocabulary that we talked about several slides ago. Some high-tech devices or apps will provide access to a wonderful way for children to use basic or coverage vocabulary. However, those would not be considered robust. They don't have that developmental vocabulary that will help that child continue to grow beyond what they need to communicate about right now. But they still may have a role to play in that child's learning. And so you can use things like the Go Talk Now app or other lighter versions of communication apps that are usually either free or maybe lower cost and available on iPads and other tablets to build basic coverage and teach language with a high-tech system like Go Talk Now. In the middle, we have an opportunity to see some robust language. And so this is TD Snap. Some of our high-tech devices are going to have access to robust page sets where they not only think about what the learner needs right now, but also that developmental vocabulary that the learner needs for future development. So if you have access to these systems through a loan library, or for example, through some of the ASHA privileges that you get as an SLP, if you're an SLP, you can get some free access to some of these robust apps and maybe run them on your personal technology or that belongs to your agency. You'd be able to try out some of these robust apps with families and learners when it's appropriate. And then on the far right-hand side, we can also think about apps that are pragmatically organized, such as this one here, which is the SimPod app. Again, this course does not go into great detail on how you compare each of these apps or how you might determine whether one is good for a child or not. It goes beyond the scope of what we can talk about, but I just wanted to make sure that you know what's available out there, these very big differences in the ways that apps represent language potential. So that as you're looking through apps and you're talking about them with families who may come to you with questions, you have a little bit of a sense of, okay, some of them are basic and their coverage, some of them are robust and they offer coverage and developmental, some of them are organized more in a grid that's related to linguistic and semantic syntactic types of organizations, and then some of them are more pragmatically organized. And it'll be a longer process to determine which one of these may be suitable for the learners you're working with. But beyond those grid-based displays, I also wanted to bring to your attention that visual scenes may be a great way to provide not necessarily language building, but participation for kids that you're working with. So remember, as we talked about mid-tech, we talked about the difference between participation and language building. Participation-based tools are really not going to offer robust access to language. They're usually very specific to a context. They have minimal vocabulary on them compared to robust options, but they could be a great place to really open the gate for AAC learning, especially for really young learners. So I put 3 different examples here. On the far left-hand side, we can think about how we could use some of these visual scenes that have hotspots on them to embed language and messages related to a particular activity. So here is a snap scene made by Toby Dynavox. And in that app, you can take photographs. This is of a little girl with her father reading a book. And you can program hotspots on that photograph that have voice output messages related to that activity. And so that would give the learner access to however many messages you programmed on that screen. In contrast, the one in the center would be a one-touch option for participation. So this is one option, which is Pictello app, that you could create a version of that digital photo album that we looked at from a mid-tech perspective. Put some photographs about a meaningful experience or the child's family, something that's coming up in their life or something they've already done, and use photographs and voice messages, which you can type out and then record in Pictello to make a single touch way for the child to tell a personal story. And then on the far right-hand side, we have apps that allow you to sequence messages. So the first one, Snapscene, allowed you to program hotspots where the child can push in different sections of the screen to say different things. Some of our students may not have the physical dexterity yet to be able to use the touch, the hotspots in that fashion, but you may want to do more than just this linear message related to an activity, such as singing a song. So you could use an app like Tap Speak Sequence, which I've put here as an example, and program a song into it step by step. And that way, every time the child hits the center of that screen, a new segment of the song could be brought up in a voice recording and they can sing along. Let's not forget too that no tech tools belong in our overall system. And so I encourage you, take a moment, pause here, stretch your mind, stretch your body, and think about where would no tech tools fit into engineering and embedding AAC into the environment. Although you won't be able to physically see them, perhaps you want to make sure that in your coaching, you remind families that using a certain gesture that you're targeting, a certain vocalization, modeling that is a valuable tool to have in place for this particular activity. Sometimes you can even include these reminders on visual cheat sheets of sorts that you put up in the home for families. So for example, and you'll learn more about this when you learn from Stephanie coming up in her partner strategies and interaction strategies lecture. Our two Stephanies will come supporting you in those fashions. You can put some reminders up to tell families, what are we targeting when we're in this environment in the home? Not only what visuals may be available for the learner as far as picture-based tools, but maybe we want to put up there, don't forget here to use your gesture of knocking on the cabinet door to open the cabinet for getting a snack choice, for example. So we'll wrap up here to just kind of see how some of these broader light tech, no tech, mid tech, high tech types of ideas can be put into place, thinking about the activity first. So here's some examples of how you can use these tools for special events. We already talked a little bit about that talking photo album and being a way that that child could tell a personal narrative about perhaps a trick-or-treating experience or a Halloween party that they're going to. On the left-hand side, Mary Catherine's got here a single voice output button that she's programmed with Trick or Treat. She's put that onto the lap of the child, and as that child is going through the neighborhood in their wheelchair, they're able to hit that button and it will say Trick or Treat at the right time for that wonderful neighbor to pop some candy into their treat bag. The middle example is some light tech ways to provide access to the activity-based vocabulary of trick-or-treating. So you can see words that have been printed on a single bracelet or wrapped around that little girl's arm. And therefore, as she's trick-or-treating, she can point to different words that are relevant to that particular context. And then on the far right here, we've got a digital picture frame and a picture of some deliciously cute little ones here dressed in costumes. And so perhaps this is where the little guy in the middle could talk about what he was for Halloween by going up to that picture frame in his home and touching the button and telling a little story about what happened on Halloween. We can also think about how to embed these types of tools into playtime. So we have 3 examples here on the screen. On the far left-hand side, this is a pretend play activity about a donut shop. Mary Catherine's programmed some simple messaging on this button here related to the donut shop. Maybe it's something like, what kind of donut do you want to buy today? And then underneath that button, you can see some light tech boards that have different vocabulary. So more of that language building function versus participation is coming through with the light tech support, which has tons of activity-based vocabulary related to running the donut shop activity. In the center, very similar, we've got an activity box set up here. It's got Thomas the Train. You can see there's a core language board, light tech version that's been taped up to the wall where this activity happens. And then there's a little step-by-step voice output button in the front there that's got some common participation phrases that you might see a young child using when they're playing this game. And so you can combine these different modalities of that light tech core board, which is language building, and that mid-tech step-by-step, which is participation, and really add richness to this experience so that that child gets a little voice output, they get some language immersion through modeling on the core board, all around this very favorite and motivating activity of playing with trains. And similarly, on the right-hand side here, we've got a little one who's playing at the grocery store with some pretend play items available. And you can see we've got two different types of supports available. There's a a light tech board that has some vocabulary related to grocery store. And then the Snap Scene app, which we just learned about a couple slides ago, has been programmed with a grocery shelf and some food items on it so that when that child hits each food item, I imagine she could hear the name of the food. So here we've got apple, banana, orange, etc. We can also think about embedding these types of supports into care and living routines. So at the start, when we started talking about embedding, I brought to your attention this door hanger idea. This is another one of Mary Catherine's ideas where she's put some coming and going vocabulary related to maybe going out in the backyard or going for a drive right there where it happens on a door hanger. Similarly, in the middle, we've got an ice pack, and this little one's been injured. And so they've put a communication board inside the ice pack just for communication related to being hurt. And then it's there right when you want to grab it. Similarly, we've got a diaper wipes container here on the right-hand side, and the language related to the activity of diapering is right there on the wipes container, which will be readily available for the daycare provider or for the mom or dad who is diapering that child so that they can model the relevant vocabulary that occurs during that routine. We can also see creative ways here of putting some technologies and some light tech supports into messy and wet play. I think one of the most important things to remember about light tech supports is that they are a great way to bring language into these messy activities when technology is not very suited. So here on the left-hand side, you've got a water bin activity, kind of like a water table outside in an outdoor pool. And Mary Catherine's put a core vocabulary board inside a simple Ziploc bag with some waterproof duct tape. And now that board can float and the adults and children around can model language as they play in the water. Similarly, in the middle here, we've got a little one who's in a bubble bath, and they're using a Pixie Pal, which is a commercially available Tupperware of sorts that you can put light text supports into. And actually, it has pages that you can flip, and they're all waterproof. And I've created a link here to Pixie Pal in case you want to learn more about it. But what a great way to offer access to either core or activity-based vocabulary around the soapy bath time activity, which is likely pretty motivating for most little ones that are participating in it. And then another example here of an activity box that's got kinetic sand in it. And Mary Catherine stuck up that core board right there in the activity box. It's laminated, so it doesn't have to, you don't have to worry about it getting ruined. You don't have to worry about sand getting into the high-tech mechanisms, and it's right there where the activity happens, so you know that the words are going to be at arm's length when it comes to modeling for that little one during this really fun construction and sand activity. Excuse me. So I had mentioned a couple slides ago in our visual scenes a few activities or a few options rather of creating participation using some of those high-tech apps. I wanted to take a minute to just demonstrate a few of them for you here. So on the left-hand side, we see that tap speak sequence, which was the one that I mentioned. You can program a song on. And so I'll just play for you the song so you can kind of get a sense of how it works. To set it up, in essence, if you have been around for a while in the AAC world, you remember the the step-by-step buttons. I had a blue one in the Thomas the Train slide a couple slides ago, but it was basically one button, and they still make them, you can get them, that you can program a series of messages on. And that way, every time the child hits the button, it says a different message. Now, you can use that to participate in a lot of different ways. It can either be a sequenced message where the child can participate in each step of an activity, such as what I'm about to show you with the song, or it may be just different ways of errorless participation within an activity. So, for example, if they're having a dance party together in the living room and the child wants to comment on mom and dad's dance moves, there may be a series of messages related to commenting on the dance moves programmed right into the button. So let's take a look about how I've done this with the Tap Speak Sequence app. I've created, just by grabbing images off the internet, an image per page, and then I've created a message recording per page. And so imagine every time that the screen changes, it's because the child has touched the screen to advance it to the next stage.
Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. If you see a crocodile, don't forget to scream. Ah!
So that's Tap Speak Sequence. And then here in the middle, this is Snap Scene, and a little bit of a different way to think about using Snap Scene. Remember, Snap Scene and apps like it have the ability for you to program hotspots on different parts of the screen. So here I've imagined a shared reading activity where the learner can use this Big Mac button up here on the right to participate in the Brown Bear book. It's a single message. The repetitive line that the student can say is, what do you see? Because that's the one that comes up a lot. And so maybe mom and dad are reading the book and they're pausing at this time in the book. Every time what do you see comes up to allow that learner to participate with this voice output Big Mac. And then you see below it, I've got a light tech board here that's got language related to the Brown Bear book. So maybe I have that available right inside the book, and mom and dad then pull that out and can model by showing the language related to the book. And then at the end, there's that great page in the Brown Bear book where you get to rehearse kind of like what you saw in the book. And a lot of the kids really love doing this. If you've been around a 2 to 4 year old group in a while, you know that they love pointing out what they saw in the book. And so I've created here a snap scene page where each hotspot on the book, which is the little red lines that are around the animals, as a student touches it, it would be able to say what they saw. So let's see how that sounds.
I see a brown bear. I see a red bird. I see a yellow duck.
You can get the hang there. And so these visual scenes are a great way to just really take an image and have it come to life from a communication participation perspective. It can be a photograph, it can be an inset puzzle that you take a photo of in the child's home, something that they love. It can be a book, like in this example. Really, the possibilities are endless to help facilitate communication participation in something that the child really is familiar with. Just a reminder, when you're thinking about all these tools and how to embed them in the space, we really need to keep our elements in mind. We already know that multimodal is where we're going. We want to make sure we're thinking outside the box, light tech, mid tech, no tech, all of it, but that we've got that accessibility, the usefulness, the feasibility, and the acceptability principles in mind. As we wrap up, I just want to speak a little bit to how we might adjust thinking about those elements of an appropriate starter system when we're thinking about vision needs and motor needs. Remember, Ethan has both of these, and the tools I just shared with you, many of them did not have the properties that Ethan would need specifically to participate in his routines using AAC in a way that he can perceive and also physically access with his fine motor limitations. So I wanted to go through some general things that we might consider for vision and physical access, but really leaving with you that working with your occupational and physical therapy team and TVIs or vision impairment specialists is going to be key to help you tease out which of these general strategies might be most meaningful and effective for a learner that you have in mind with vision and physical needs. Whenever we're thinking about vision, we really want to think about these main aspects here on your screen. So the bullets have light, color, complexity, contrast, and representation. So let's walk through some of these visuals and just kind of touch on a few how these elements are considered in these very different tools from what we've already explored together. The first one here, you see a high contrast communication book. It's black with some very bright uniform colored symbols on it. So this really represents that idea of using color and contrast together. We would use this with a learner who might benefit from high contrast in order to be able to have imagery that they need to pay attention to coming off the printed page. If we know that a student, for example, with cortical visual impairment has an anchor color or a color that they're more likely to pay attention to, we might use color in that way here on this visual as well. You can also see here that we've thought about complexity because we've certainly not provided access to robust vocabulary here. It's only 4 cells, but there are pages that we can turn to get access to more vocabulary, and the partner can help with that. But we can reduce the complexity to 4 cells in order to help that visual component for the learner as well. I also might think about with a communication book like this first example, using no laminate or a non-glare laminate, because another aspect of light that we want to consider is when we're using laminated supports with a child with a vision impairment, the glare from the lights hitting the lamination can often confuse and make the image more complex or obscure its details. So we want to work with laminate and glare and other aspects of the experience to make sure that that's not a barrier for learners with vision impairment. And then lastly, in this top left-hand example with the high contrast board, we're looking here at representation in 2-dimensional drawings. So that's one way to represent vocabulary, but it may not be effective for children with certain vision needs. And so we're going to work with our TVIs and other vision experts to help us know how we can represent language in a way that's discernible and easy for our learners with, for example, cortical visual impairment to process. So I want to jump down then to the bottom left-hand visual, which is several black squares with objects actually adhered to them. This may be an alternative way to represent language for a child who needs 3-dimensional objects for one reason or another. They might need 3-dimension because they're not yet processing 2-dimension visually. Or they may need 3-dimension because they're completely blind and they're not seeing imagery, but only able to rely on their tactile interpretation of those symbols. Jumping over to the right-hand side, straight across from that tangible symbol example is another image that really just helps you think about this idea of using representation hierarchies. And we don't use representation hierarchies for cognitive reasons. That's a myth, it's old school, we don't think about it anymore. But we do sometimes need to use representation for visual or attentional needs. And so here we've got lots of different examples of how we could represent a concept like a drink in different representation modalities. So we've got the printed symbol on the bottom right-hand side. That's printed red cup to mean drink. We also have a physical cup. We have a partial half of a cup that's like a tactile symbol, etc. We can also see here on the top right-hand side, one other aspect of vision that I want you to consider, and that is the power of backlighting. So many of our students that we might not consider high-tech versions of AAC, so we might not consider tablet-based apps because we really want to limit complexity, for example. We might consider them just for the sake of the backlighting, because as you can see in this example, the left-hand side is a printed support, and the right-hand side is the same images on a backlit tablet. And what you probably see without even trying very hard is they're jumping off of that screen. So we've got light, color, contrast, all working in our advantage to help that student attend to the image and also interpret, hopefully, what it means. So again, these are very generic considerations. You're always going to work with your vision team to help you better understand your individual students' vision needs. But similarly, we want to think about adjusting for motor needs, and we're going to work with our OTs and PTs to help us with this. Some general things, however, to consider are we may need to change the position of our communication books, boards, or tablets. You can see here two commercially available options at the top left-hand side are a slant board or an all-in-one board that will really help us bring that book or tablet or whatever we want that student to be able to visually see and also access perhaps with their hand or their eye gaze to a level that makes that possible. We don't want students down here trying to communicate. We really want them up here because it gives them better visual engagement with their partner and also better use of their hands and better use of their gaze. And so using some slant boards or other positioning tools can really be a helpful way to achieve that. We also need to think about positioning of the child, and children are going to be able to use their bodies differently in different positions, especially children with motor differences. So we may find that when the child is laying on the floor, for example, we need to position AAC tools in a different way than when that child is seated in a supported seat, like a Riften chair or a wheelchair. Secondly, we want to think about access methods. Not all of our students will be able to use their touch, especially early on in their journey, such as the under 5 population. And so while we're working with motor colleagues to help our kids learn how to access in more effective ways, we want to think about some alternative ways of providing access to vocabulary. So for example, immediately underneath the slant board, you have here a partner assisted scanning core board. And so, not like the grids that you were used to seeing in the previous examples that would really require that child to touch and see each one of those symbols. This partner assisted scanning board is really allowing the partner to systematically scan through those and the child to indicate in their yes and no signal whether or not that word is the one that they're thinking about. Similarly, on the right-hand side, directly to the right here, we've got 4 symbols placed very separate, very far apart. And again, this may be for an alternative access purpose. So this could be, this placement could be used for an eye gaze frame. So if you can imagine the middle of this cut out, and then the student can use eye gaze to select those words. Or this could be a great way for a student who doesn't yet have an isolated point to be able to touch that vocabulary with a whole hand movement, for example, without overlapping with other neighboring words. So you can explore alternative access, doing some research and learning on your own. There's many courses available to help you have a better understanding of alternative access. This is not one of those courses, but I just want to plant the seed to help you think about these adjustments that may be needed in a starter system for a learner that has motor needs. So this is where we're going to end. Again, I hope that you found some of these ideas inspiring. The takeaways here are really that we want to be more apt to model those language forms, and so we want to make them available. You can see all of the resources in today's presentation embedded throughout the slides and also here on the Padlet that you can access either by clicking the link in your slide handout or scanning the QR code using your mobile device. And I really hope that you learned something that you can take away today and also carry into the next 2 modules with Stephanie P and Stephanie E as they walk you through coaching families to be solid AAC partners to their little ones. If you have any questions about this training module, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. My contact information is made available here on your learning platform, and I look forward to seeing you in another training.